The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not that the day of the week mattered much to Clara Whitfield anymore, because all the days had started to feel the same since her husband died. The same gray weight pressing down from the moment she opened her eyes to the moment she finally let them close again. But she remembered it was Tuesday because the youngest, little Owen, had been coughing since Sunday, and she had been counting the days, hoping the cough would pass the way small sicknesses pass, when children have enough food and warmth and rest. Owen had none of those things in the amounts he needed. None of them did. The letter was from a man named Hargrove. She did not know him personally, but she knew the name the way everyone in Caldwell County, Tennessee knew it, the way you know the name of a cold wind. Hargrove owned the debt her late husband Edmund had taken on 3 years before his death, the debt that had seemed manageable when Edmund was alive and working, and that had become a slow-moving flood the moment he was gone. The letter said she had 45 days. 45 days to pay what was owed, or vacate the land and the house and everything on it. Clara read the letter standing at the kitchen table. She did not sit down. She did not cry. She set the paper flat on the table and pressed her palm against it, as if she could push it back into the envelope, back into the leather satchel of whatever writer had delivered it, back into the past where it had not yet been written. Then she took her hand away and went to stir the pot on the stove. She was 34 years old. She had 7 children. The oldest was a girl named Nell, 14, serious as a stone wall, already carrying responsibilities no 14-year-old ought to carry. Below Nell came George, 12, who had taken on Edmund's habit of checking the sky every morning, the way a farmer must. Then Lucy, 10, who was the one who sang, who filled the house with sound, even when there was nothing to be cheerful about. Then the twins, Albert and Edna, 8 years old, and inseparable in the way twins sometimes are, as if they were still partly of one mind. Then Frances, 5, who had inherited her father's calm eyes and her mother's stubborn mouth. And then Owen, 3 years old, coughing since Sunday, asleep right now in the back room on the bed he shared with Frances. 7 children, 1 pot of thin soup on the stove, 45 days. Clara had not been a woman who indulged herself in self-pity even before Edmund's death, and she was not about to start now. But there was a particular kind of loneliness that came from being the only adult in a household, from being the person every frightened child looked to in the night, from knowing that your face was the face they read the future in. If she looked scared, they would be scared. If she looked hopeless, they would understand, in the wordless way children understand things, that the ground was not solid beneath them. So she did not look scared. She kept her face the way she kept the kitchen, which was to say functional, clean, and giving nothing away. What she had was the land, 12 acres of it, mostly workable, in the foothills east of the river. Edmund had cleared 6 of those acres himself, over years, 1 stump at a time, and had been proud of it in the quiet way he was proud of most things. The house was small but sound. The well was good. The barn was in reasonable shape. Though the eastern wall needed attention, she had not had the time or money to give it. There was a garden, and Clara had made it work harder than most gardens were made to work, coaxing food out of it that a wealthier woman would not have needed to coax. There were 3 chickens. There had been 4, but the oldest had stopped laying 2 weeks ago, and Clara had made the decision a person in her situation had to make. She had tried everything the shape of her life allowed her to try. She had written to Edmund's brother in Virginia, a man named Clarence who had married well and lived in a brick house, and who wrote back 2 months later with a letter full of sympathy and empty of any offer. She had spoken to the minister, who was a genuinely kind man, but had a congregation full of people struggling in the same directions as Clara, and who had done what he could, which was not enough. She had taken in mending and washing from the 3 families in the area who had enough surplus to pay someone else to do it, and she had done that work at night after the children were asleep, her hands moving by lamplight while her eyes burned. It had not been enough. It was not going to be enough. The hardest thing was not the poverty itself. Clara had been poor before, in her girlhood, and she knew how to navigate it. The hardest thing was the arithmetic. She could add the numbers in any order and they came out the same way every time. What she owed was more than what she had, and more than what she could make in 45 days. The gap between those 2 figures was not a gap she could close by working harder, or sleeping less, or going without in any further way. She had already closed every gap she could close. This one was final. The night the letter arrived, after all 7 children were asleep, Clara sat at the table with the lamp turned low and allowed herself, for exactly the time it took to drink 1 cup of weak tea, to think about what would happen if she failed. She thought about it plainly and without flinching, because she believed that a person who could not look at the worst thing was not truly prepared to fight against it. The children would need somewhere to go. Clarence in Virginia, useless as he had been, was still family. The minister might know of families who could take 1 or 2. Nell was old enough to go into service. It was a thought that came to her like a stone dropping into still water, and she felt the ripple of it move through her whole body. She stood up before she finished the tea. She was not going to lose her children. She had not made that decision with any particular drama. It was simply the decision that was available to her, the only one, and she made it the way she made all her decisions, which was completely and without looking back. She blew out the lamp and stood a moment in the dark kitchen. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees at the edge of the property, and somewhere in that sound was the sound of the land that Edmund had cleared, and the land that she had worked, and the land that 7 children had grown up on, and had a right to keep growing up on. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time, but when sleep finally came, she slept hard, because she needed the strength, and her body knew it, even when her mind was still moving. The next morning she was up before light. There were chickens to feed, and a child to check on. Owen's cough had loosened a little in the night, which was something. Frances had climbed in with him at some point, and was curled against his back with her small arm around him, keeping him warm in the way children instinctively keep each other warm. Clara stood in the doorway of that room for perhaps 4 seconds, looking at her 2 youngest. Then she turned and went to start the fire. She had 44 days. Nell came into the kitchen while Clara was mixing the morning cornbread, moving quietly the way Nell always moved, with the careful consideration of someone who was always half listening for trouble. Nell had her father's dark eyes and his way of standing, straight and still. She looked at her mother, and she looked at the letter that was still on the table, because Clara had not yet decided what to do with it, and she did not ask about it. She picked up the water bucket and went out to the well. Clara watched her go. She thought about what it meant that a 14-year-old girl could read a situation so accurately that she did not need to ask the question, that she simply went and did the useful thing without being told. It meant Nell had been paying attention. It meant Nell had been carrying something she was too young to carry. Clara felt the familiar sharp feeling that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but something that lived between the two, and then she put it somewhere useful and finished the cornbread. George came down next, then Lucy, then the twins in a knot of elbows and whispered arguing, then Frances, leading Owen by the hand. Owen looked pale, but he was upright, and his eyes were clear, and when he saw the cornbread he reached for it with both hands. That was a good sign. Clara cut him the first piece and watched him eat it standing at the table, still in his sleeping clothes, crumbs dropping onto the floor, absolutely unbothered by anything in the world except the cornbread. She thought, I am going to keep this. I am going to keep all of this. She did not know yet how, but the thought was not a wish. It was a fact she had decided to make true. And there is a difference between those 2 things, a difference that Clara Whitfield understood down to her bones. She had 44 days, 1 pot, 7 children, 12 acres, and a stubbornness that her mother had always called her greatest flaw, and that she had long since decided was her greatest asset. She poured herself a cup of coffee, weak as river water. She stood at the window and looked out at the October morning coming up over her land, gray and cold and completely indifferent to her situation, the way mornings are. And she started thinking. The first week after the letter, Clara did not stop moving. Motion was the thing she understood best when the ground beneath her shifted, and so she moved. From before sunrise to well after dark, her hands always doing something, her mind always running a step or 2 ahead. She sent George and Nell out to the Pender farm 3 miles east to ask about day work, and both of them came back with the news that the Penders had nothing to offer, their own harvest having been meager that year, and that the Calloway family up near the ridge had already turned away 2 other men asking the same question. Clara listened, thanked them, and sent them out again the next morning in a different direction. The county had a small town at its center, a place called Darbyton, with a general store, a feed mill, a blacksmith, a post office, and a church. Clara went to Darbyton on the third day after the letter arrived, leaving Nell in charge at home, which Nell accepted without a word, because Nell had been accepting things without a word for 2 years. Clara walked the 4 miles because the horse had died in July, another calculation she was still absorbing, and arrived at the general store with mud on her boots and her best dress on, which was not a particularly fine dress but was clean and whole. The man who ran the general store was named Amos Burke, a round-faced man in his 50s, who had known Edmund, and who spoke to Clara with genuine sympathy that was nonetheless entirely useless. He could not extend more credit. He was sympathetic about this. He explained it at length. Clara thanked him, bought a small amount of salt and a spool of thread with the last coins in her pocket, and went to the post office. She wrote to every person she could think of who might have knowledge, resources, or connections she did not have. She wrote to a woman she had been close to before her marriage, a woman named Dorothy Hale, who had married a lawyer in Nashville. She wrote to a former employer of Edmund's, a mill owner named Crawford, who she knew had been fond of her husband. She wrote to the county land office asking about any program or provision for widows in debt. She wrote 4 letters with a borrowed pen and sent them knowing that even if all 4 arrived and were answered generously, the answers would not come in time. The children had learned not to ask about the letter, not because Clara had told them not to, but because they read the air in the house the way children always read it, with perfect accuracy, and knew that asking would not help. What they did instead was become, each in their own way, remarkably useful. Nell managed the younger ones with a competence that would have made Clara proud if she had not been too tired to feel much of anything beyond the immediate. George worked the garden without being asked, turning the soil for the winter planting with a focus that was too adult for his 12-year-old face. Lucy kept the younger children occupied with games that cost nothing, stories she made up, songs she taught them. The twins, Albert and Edna, did the feeding and the carrying with an efficiency that bordered on solemn. Frances watched over Owen. Clara saw all of this and said very little about it, because what was there to say? The children were doing what children do when they understand, without being told, that the situation requires it. She was proud of them with a fierceness that had nowhere to go, that just sat in her chest and burned quietly. The second week brought news. Not good news, not bad news exactly, but news. A woman from the church, a Mrs. Isabel Grant, came to the house on a Wednesday afternoon with a basket containing a small smoked ham, a jar of preserved beans, and the information that Hargrove had apparently done the same thing to 2 other families in the county in the past year. One of those families had left. The other had managed to hold on, though Mrs. Grant did not know the particulars of how. Clara thanked her for the food, which was genuinely needed, and asked if she knew who in the area might know the particulars. Mrs. Grant thought about it, and said she believed the family's name was Alderton, and that they lived up near Canby Ridge. Canby Ridge was 7 miles away, over rough ground. Clara went on Thursday. She left at first light with Nell in charge and a piece of cornbread in her coat pocket, and walked the 7 miles through cold air that smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves. She found the Alderton farm in the early afternoon, a place that looked to be surviving in much the same way her own farm was surviving, which was to say by force of will, and not much else. The woman who answered the door was named Ruth Alderton, a thin woman, a few years older than Clara, with hands that told the same story as Clara's own hands. Ruth gave her tea, and told her the story plainly, without flourish. The way they had held on was that a man had helped them, not a local man, not a church-going neighbor or a sympathetic creditor, but a man who lived up in the mountain country above Canby Ridge, and who had, for reasons Ruth did not entirely understand even now, intervened at a moment when intervention seemed impossible. He had paid what was owed, not given money to Ruth to pay it herself, gone directly to the holder of the debt and paid it. Then he had helped them get the farm onto steadier ground over the following months, with labor and with a knowledge of the land, and with connections she could not have made on her own. Clara sat very still through this. She asked who the man was. Ruth said his name was Calhoun, just Calhoun. She was not sure if that was a given name or a family name and had never asked. He was not someone you asked a great many questions of. She said this without any particular feeling attached to it, just as a fact about the man. He was somewhere in his late 40s or perhaps his 50s. It was hard to say. He lived mostly alone up in the hills above the ridge, had done for years. He came down occasionally to trade or to buy supplies. Where his money came from, Ruth did not know. She had not asked that either. Clara asked how she had reached him. Ruth said she had not. He had come to her. On the walk back to her farm, all 7 miles of it in the fading afternoon light, Clara turned this information over like a stone she had found in a field, examining it from every side. A man who came to people and helped them without being asked. A man who had gone directly to the debt holder and settled what was owed. A man nobody seemed to know much about, who lived alone in the hill country, who could not be reached because there was no way to reach him. She was a practical woman. She did not believe in waiting for things to arrive. She believed in going to get them. But you could not go to get something whose location you did not know. She got home as the last light was leaving the sky. Nell had the children fed, and the fire built up, and Owen in bed early. Clara stood in the kitchen and looked at her oldest daughter standing there in the lamplight, 14 years old, capable and tired, and something moved through Clara that was too large to name. "Thank you," she said. Nell looked at her. "Was it useful, the walk?" "I think so," Clara said. "I don't know yet." Nell nodded the way her father used to nod when information was incomplete but worth keeping. "There's soup left," she said. Clara sat down and ate the soup. It was thin, but it was warm. Outside, the wind had picked up. It came off the ridge country to the north, and Clara sat at the table after she had eaten and listened to it, thinking about a man named Calhoun who lived up in the hills and who came to people when they needed him. She thought about it for a long time. Then she thought, but how does he know who needs him? And then she thought, someone tells him. She sat up a little straighter. Someone in the county knew this man. Someone had contact with him, or passed word to him, or was a link in the chain between his world and the world down here, where people were losing their land and their children's futures. Somewhere between Calhoun's hillside and Ruth Alderton's kitchen there had been a connection. Clara did not know what it was, but she had never yet found a piece of information that did not connect to another piece of information if you pulled it hard enough. She put on her coat. She went out to the barn to check the eastern wall and see how bad it had gotten. It had gotten bad. She stood in the dark barn with a lantern, looking at where the boards had begun to separate, and she made a list in her head of what it would take to fix it. Then she made a separate list in her head of everything she still needed to find out. The eastern wall could wait 2 more weeks, maybe 3. The other list could not wait at all. By the end of the second week, she had gathered 3 more pieces. The first was from the blacksmith in Darbyton, a man named Howard Cole who had shod horses for the mountain men who occasionally came through, and who said yes, he knew who Calhoun was, not personally but by reputation, and that the man had a good name up in the hill country, meaning he was honest and kept his word, which in Howard Cole's estimation were the only qualities that mattered. The second piece came from a woman at the church, elderly Mrs. Pruitt, who said that her nephew, who ran a trading post up near the Carver Creek crossing, had spoken with Calhoun not 2 months past, that Calhoun had come in for flour and oil and a length of rope, that he had been perfectly pleasant but not talkative, and that her nephew might know how to get word to him if anyone needed to. The third piece was harder, and came from a man she would not have thought to ask, except that she had run out of easier people to ask. His name was Edgar Doone, and he lived on a thin strip of rocky land 2 miles south of her own farm, a man in his 60s who had a reputation for being difficult, and who was difficult, but who had also lived in this county his entire life, and knew things about it that no one else knew. Clara went to Edgar Doone with nothing to offer but directness, which turned out to be exactly what Edgar Doone responded to. He looked at her for a long moment when she explained her situation and what she needed, and then he said that if she wanted to get word to Calhoun, the fastest way was through a man named Ira Shepherd who ran the trading post at Carver Creek, which matched what Mrs. Pruitt had said, and that Ira Shepherd was about the most trustworthy person in the county, and would pass word if it was worth passing. Clara was at the Carver Creek trading post by Friday afternoon of the second week. She had left Nell with a list of instructions, and a prayer that Owen's cough stayed quiet. She had walked 12 miles over 2 days, sleeping the night between at the home of the Alderton family, who had offered without being asked. Ruth Alderton had fed her and given her a blanket and asked no questions, which Clara found to be among the kindest things a person could do. Ira Shepherd was a lean man with careful eyes who listened to everything she said before he spoke. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he could pass word, that he could not promise it would reach Calhoun quickly, or that Calhoun would act on it, and that he never delivered messages with expectations attached to them, because that was how word got distorted. Clara said she understood completely, and that she was not asking for a promise. She was asking only for a chain of communication to exist where currently there was none. Ira Shepherd said that was fair enough. He wrote something on a small piece of paper. He folded it and held it and looked at her steadily. "What you've got to understand," he said, "is that Calhoun does this on his own terms. You can't pull him down out of those hills by sending word. You can only let him know the shape of things and trust that he'll make his own judgment." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not trying to pull anyone anywhere." Ira Shepherd seemed to consider this answer. Then he tucked the folded paper into his coat pocket. "I'll see that it gets to him," he said. Clara walked the 12 miles home over 2 days, and she did not know if what she had done would produce anything at all. She had 31 days left. She had sent word into the hill country like throwing a stone into fog, not knowing if it would land or where. She had done everything else there was to do, and it had not been enough. This was the last thread available to her, and she had pulled on it, and now she had to wait, which was the thing she was worst at. She arrived home on a Sunday evening to find that Owen's cough was better, that George had fixed a loose hinge on the barn door, that Lucy had taught Francis a new song, and that Nell had somehow made a pot of soup out of what appeared to be very little indeed. Clara ate the soup. She looked at her 7 children in the lamplight. She did not pray. She was not against prayer, but she believed more in legs than in prayers, and her legs had already done what they could. What happened next was out of her hands. She washed the bowl and went to bed. He came on a gray morning, 11 days after she had sent word through Ira Shepherd, with 16 days left on the 45 Hargrove had given her. Clara did not see him arrive. She was in the garden pulling the last of the frostbitten vegetables when Nell appeared at the edge of the porch and said, in the careful voice Nell used when she was controlling something, "Mama, there is a man at the gate." Clara straightened up. She had dirt on her hands and cold in her bones, and her hair was mostly out of whatever arrangement she had put it in that morning. She walked around the side of the house to the front gate and stopped. The man standing at the gate was not what she had imagined, though she could not have said precisely what she had imagined. He was large. Not in a showy way, but in the way of a man who had spent decades doing hard physical work in all weather, a solidity that seemed less like a body type, and more like a feature of the landscape. He was somewhere between 50 and 60, she thought, though the outdoors had weathered him in ways that made the question difficult to answer. He wore a canvas coat that had seen a great deal of use, and boots that were good quality and old. His face was unremarkable in its individual parts, and somehow completely itself as a whole. He had gray eyes that were doing, right now, what she suspected they usually did, which was look at a thing and understand it, without making a production of the understanding. He had a hat in his hands. He was not wearing it. He had taken it off when he saw her come around the corner of the house, and he held it in a way that was respectful without being performative. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. His voice was level and not loud. "My name is Calhoun." Clara looked at him across the gate for a moment. She was aware, in some corner of her mind, that Nell was still on the porch behind her, very still. She was aware that the morning was cold, and that the garden was half finished, and that she had 16 days. She was aware of all of these things, and she set them aside for exactly the seconds she needed to look at this man and take the measure of him. "Mr. Calhoun," she said, "I wasn't sure you would come." "I wasn't sure either," he said, not as an apology, as a fact. She opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in, and she noticed that he moved through the gate and across the yard without looking around in the curious or assessing way that people new to a property usually moved. He was looking at her, or rather, he was not particularly looking at anywhere, simply moving where invited, unhurried, taking up exactly the space he occupied and no more. In the kitchen, Clara put the coffee pot on and stood at the stove with her back to him for a moment. She heard the sound of him setting his hat on the table and settling into the chair she had not needed to indicate. She heard the kitchen the way she always heard it when she needed to think. The particular creak of the floor, the sound of the fire, the small distant sounds of the children somewhere in the back of the house. She turned around and put 2 cups on the table and sat down across from him. "I'll tell you everything straight," she said. "I think that's the only way to do this." "I appreciate that," he said. So she told him. She told him about the debt and the letter, and Hargrove and the 45 days that were now 16. She told him about Edmund, not at length, just the shape of it, the work he had done and the debt he had taken on with good faith intentions, and the illness that had taken him before he could resolve it. She told him about the 7 children in terms he could use, their ages, their capabilities, their health, what each one needed that she was currently unable to provide. She told him what she had tried in the weeks since the letter. She told him about Ruth Alderton, and about Ira Shepherd, and about the chain of people it had taken to get word to him. She was thorough, and she was quick, and she did not dress any of it up. Calhoun listened. He drank his coffee. He did not interject, and he did not make the sounds that people sometimes make to show they are listening. He simply listened, completely, the way very few people listen, the way that made you feel that every word was actually being received and examined, rather than just tolerated until your turn to speak. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a crow landed in the bare tree at the edge of the yard and sat there. "How much is the debt?" he asked. She told him. He nodded, not in a way that indicated the amount was small or that it did not matter, just a nod that said the number had been received and placed. "And Hargrove," he said. "Do you know the man personally?" "No," she said. "I know of him." "I know him," Calhoun said. He did not say this with any particular heat. It was simply information. Clara waited. "The house and the land," he said. "Tell me about the land." She told him about the 12 acres, the 6 that Edmund had cleared, the garden, the well, the barn with its eastern wall, the quality of the soil in the 2 fields. She told him what had been planted, and what the yield had been in each of the past 3 years, and what she believed the land was capable of under better management than she had been able to provide. She was not modest about this. She said plainly that a woman managing 12 acres alone with 7 children to care for could not give the land the attention it needed, and that she knew this, and that it was not failure. It was arithmetic. Calhoun looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes. "No," he said. "It's not failure." He picked up his cup and held it without drinking from it. He appeared to be thinking, not in the way that people sometimes think loudly, showing you the process, but in the way that some people think deeply and silently, and then speak only when they have reached somewhere specific. "What do you want?" he said. It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. "I want to keep my children and my land," she said. "I want to pay what is owed so that Hargrove has no further claim. I want the farm to be workable by spring, so that next winter is not the same as this one." "That's 3 things," he said. "Yes," she said. He set the cup down. He looked at the table for a moment. "I can't make you any promises today," he said. "I want you to understand that before we go any further. I don't make promises I don't know yet if I can keep." "I don't need promises," Clara said. "I need information. I need to know if you're willing to look at this situation and tell me what you think." Something shifted slightly in his face, something too small to name but present. "I'm willing to do that," he said. He asked if he could see the land. Clara put on her coat and took him out to the fields. They walked the 6 cleared acres in silence mostly, with Clara pointing out the soil conditions and the drainage, and the problem area near the north corner, where the ground stayed wet too long after rain. Calhoun walked slowly and looked at things carefully, and asked 4 or 5 questions that told her immediately that he understood land in the specific way that comes only from long physical experience with it. He crouched down at one point and picked up a handful of soil and looked at it in his palm and put it back. They walked to the barn. He looked at the eastern wall for less time than Clara had expected, then went around to the back and looked at the ground at the base of the wall, which Clara had not thought to do. He came back and told her the water was pooling there after rain and working at the base of the boards. "Fix the drainage first," he said, "and the wall will last. Ignore the drainage and any new boards will go the same way." It was more useful information than anyone had given her in 2 years. They came back to the house. The children had become visible in that careful way children have when there is a stranger present and they are curious but uncertain. Nell was at the porch again. George had appeared near the barn. The twins were visible through the kitchen window. Calhoun did not make any particular effort toward the children, and did not ignore them either. He simply was present and unhurried, and the children could make of that what they would. At the gate, he put his hat back on. "I'll come back in 3 days," he said. "I need to look into a few things." "What things?" Clara asked. He looked at her steadily. "Hargrove," he said, "and a couple of other matters I'd rather not raise your expectations about until I know more." She wanted to ask more. She could feel the questions pressing. But she had said she did not need promises, and she had meant it, and the way to demonstrate that was to let him move at the pace he moved at, rather than at the pace her fear wanted. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he said. He went out the gate and up the road, and she watched him go, the big canvas-coated figure moving with that same unhurried solidity, and she stood at the gate until he was around the bend. Nell appeared at her shoulder. "Who is he?" Nell said. "His name is Calhoun," Clara said. "What does he want?" Clara thought about this. "I don't think he wants anything," she said. "I think he just came to look." She turned back toward the house. George and the twins had materialized near the door. Lucy was singing something from inside. The sound of Owen coughing reached her. Softer now. Not the worrying cough, but the tail end of one. The kind that meant the sickness was leaving. She counted. 13 days. She went inside and started dinner and kept the feeling that was building in her chest at exactly the distance she needed to keep it, because she was not a woman who could afford to feel too much of anything until she knew where things stood. But she allowed herself, just barely, just around the edges of what she permitted herself to feel, something that was not quite hope, but was the shape hope, sometimes arrived in before it was ready to announce itself. Calhoun came back in 2 days, not 3. Clara was at the stove when she heard the sound of hooves in the yard, and she thought for one unwanted moment of Hargrove's rider, and then she went to the window and looked out. It was Calhoun, on a brown horse that looked as solid and unhurried as he was, and there was a second horse behind him on a rope, a gray one, not young but sound-looking. He tied both horses at the fence post and came to the door. She let him in. He sat at the kitchen table without ceremony, and he told her what he had found. Hargrove, he said, was a man who dealt in debt the way some men dealt in cattle, which was to say as a business, without personal feeling, and what that meant practically was that he was negotiable in ways he did not advertise. Calhoun had spoken to him. He did not say where or describe the conversation in any detail. What he told her was the outcome. Hargrove would accept a payment plan across 6 months rather than the remaining lump sum within the deadline, provided that a certain amount was paid up front and that the agreement was put in writing and witnessed. The amount required up front was less than a quarter of what the original letter had demanded. Clara sat with this information. "You negotiated that," she said. "I had a conversation," he said. "Hargrove is a businessman. Businessmen respond to certain arguments." "What arguments?" Calhoun looked at her. That collecting from a widow with 7 children on a property he'd then have to manage himself, in the current economic climate, was a worse business outcome than a structured repayment with interest. The math was more persuasive than the goodwill. Clara almost smiled at this. Almost. "And the upfront amount," she said. "Where does that come from?" "From me," he said. "It was not offered with flourish or with an expectation of gratitude. It was said the way you say a fact of geography." She looked at him. "Mr. Calhoun, I cannot accept money from a stranger, with no means of repaying it, and no understanding of what you expect in return." "I'm not a stranger," he said. "I'm a person who has been in your house twice, and walked your land and drunk your coffee, and I don't expect anything in return except what I'll tell you right now, which is that I want to help you get this farm working properly. Not because I expect to own any part of it, because I believe it is a farm worth working and that your children deserve to grow up on it." She wanted to argue further. She was not a woman who accepted things easily, and there was a pride in her that had been necessary for survival, and that sometimes made generosity feel like an affront. But she was also, above everything else, a practical woman. "Why?" she said. "Why this family?" Calhoun was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. "I had a family once," he said. A long time ago. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask. The two words, once and a long time ago, did all the work there was to do. I know what it costs, he said, when the ground goes out from underneath them. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, one of the children was calling to another one, the normal sound of children moving through a yard. Clara put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them, her own hands, worn and capable. All right, she said, but I want everything written down. What you paid, what we owe you, on what terms. I will repay you, Mr. Calhoun. Maybe not this year, but I will repay you. I know you will, he said, and he said it as if it were not even a question worth having. She had not expected to feel something like relief so suddenly, had been holding herself so tightly against it for so long, that when it arrived it was almost startling. She breathed out once, long and steady, and then she was back to herself. The horses, she said, the gray one. Yours, he said. I brought her for you. You need a horse. Clara opened her mouth. Consider it part of the arrangement, he said, before she could object. A farm with no horse is a harder argument to make for productivity. She considered this for a moment. What's her name? I've been calling her Dove, he said, but she'll answer to whatever you teach her to answer to. Something about that made Clara feel, for the first time in a very long time, that a thing in her life was going to be manageable. Not easy, not without cost, but manageable. She stood up and put the coffee pot on. He stayed the better part of the morning. He went out to the barn with George, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point with the drawn intensity of a boy who wants very much to be included in whatever the adults are doing, and is uncertain whether he is allowed to be. Calhoun had looked at him and said, without making a large thing of it, "Come show me your barn." And George had gone with a straightness to his spine that Clara recognized as the posture of a boy who had been spoken to seriously by an adult man, which happened too rarely. She watched them from the kitchen window, the big man and the 12-year-old boy, walking toward the barn together. George was talking. Calhoun was listening. Lucy came and stood beside her. Is he going to stay? Lucy asked. I don't know, Clara said. I hope he stays, Lucy said simply, and went back to whatever she had been doing. The twins had taken a position of watchful curiosity. They had not spoken to Calhoun, but they had tracked his movements across the property, with the synchronized attention that twins sometimes deploy, and Clara could see that they had collectively decided he was not a threat, which for Albert and Edna was typically the first and most important question. Frances had walked directly up to him at one point, when he was coming back from the barn with George, and said, Your coat is very big, in the matter-of-fact tone Frances used for all observations. Calhoun had looked down at her and said, That's true, and Frances had nodded and walked away, apparently satisfied. Calhoun carried Owen, at some point, without it being arranged or requested. Owen had wandered out onto the porch and stood there looking uncertain, and Calhoun had been nearby and had simply picked him up, briefly, easily, the way you pick up a small child who looks uncertain, and said something to him that Clara did not hear, and Owen had looked up at him with the wide, uncomplicated acceptance of very young children, and then Calhoun had set him down again, and they had both gone on with their respective business. Clara had seen it from the garden, and had turned back to what she was doing immediately, because what she felt about it was too large and too complicated for the moment. He left in the early afternoon with the paper signed, the agreement with Hargrove mapped out in writing, and a commitment to return in 10 days to begin work on the drainage problem behind the barn. Clara walked him to the gate. The gray horse, Dove, was in the paddock now, exploring the fence line with calm curiosity. 10 days, she said. 10 days, he said. He mounted his horse and turned it toward the road. Mr. Calhoun, she said. He looked back. Thank you, she said. She did not make more of it than that. He nodded once. Then he went. She stood at the gate for a long moment. The gray horse put her head over the paddock fence and looked at her. Clara walked over and put her hand on the horse's nose, and the horse stood perfectly still and breathed against her palm. Dove, she said. The horse blinked. Clara went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table with the signed paper in front of her, and she read it through 3 times. Everything was in order. The arithmetic, for the first time in 2 years, was no longer catastrophically wrong. It was hard. It would require everything she had, but it was no longer impossible. She allowed herself to feel, for exactly as long as it took Nell to come in from the back room, something that was complete and uncomplicated, and that she had not felt in a very long time. Then Nell came in, and Clara folded the paper and put it in the drawer, and she stood up. "We need to start thinking about what to plant in the spring," she said. Nell looked at her for a moment. Then she got a piece of paper and a pencil and sat down at the table. They planned until supper. The drainage work behind the barn took 3 days, and reshaped more than just the ground. Calhoun arrived on the morning he had promised with 2 other men from the hill country, a pair of brothers named Luther and Cecil Briggs who spoke little, and worked with a concentrated, quiet efficiency that suggested they had been doing hard physical labor together for so long that words were mostly unnecessary. They dug the channel that Calhoun had mapped out, sloping it away from the barn's base, and redirected the pooling water toward the lower corner of the field, where it would feed rather than damage. George worked beside them all 3 days, not asked to, and not turned away, absorbing the method of it, with the seriousness of a boy who understood that what he was learning was going to matter for the rest of his life. Clara fed the 3 men at midday. It was not extravagant food because there was not yet extravagant food in the house, but it was good and there was enough of it, and the Briggs brothers ate it without comment and thanked her with nods that managed to convey genuine appreciation without requiring speeches. Calhoun ate the same way he did everything, without hurry, and sometimes between bites he answered a question from one of the children or said something quiet to Clara about what they would address next. By the end of the 3rd day, the ground behind the barn was transformed in a way that was not dramatic to look at, but was deeply consequential. Water moved where it was supposed to move. The base of the eastern wall was dry. Calhoun stood looking at it in the late afternoon light, with his hands in his coat pockets, and said it would hold now, and Clara believed him. The Briggs brothers went home. Calhoun stayed. Not in the house. He slept in the barn those first weeks, in the loft, on a bedroll he had brought with him. And when Clara had initially objected to this arrangement, he had said simply that he was used to it and preferred it, and that the barn was warmer than half the places he had spent the night over the years, and she had understood that arguing was not going to move him on this point, and let it go. The children adapted to his presence with the speed that children adapt to things that are safe and consistent. Nell watched him carefully for the first 2 weeks, the way she watched everything, and then one morning Clara saw Nell asking him a direct question about why the soil at the north end of the field was a different color from the south end, and Calhoun explaining it at length, and Nell listening with the intense focus she gave things that genuinely interested her. After that, the wariness was gone. George had attached himself almost immediately, and without apology. He was at Calhoun's side during every hour of outdoor work, asking questions that were sometimes naive and sometimes remarkably perceptive, and Calhoun answered all of them with the same patience, making no distinction between the simple and the sharp. Clara watched her son's face during these exchanges, the face of a boy who had been the closest thing to a man of the house for 2 years, and who was now learning what it was to be taught, rather than to simply have to know. It was a hard thing to watch, and a good thing to watch at the same time. Lucy decided almost at once that Calhoun was interesting, and did not hesitate to tell him so. She brought him things, leaves and interesting rocks, and once a bird's feather she had found near the fence, presenting them with the confidence of someone offering valuable gifts. Calhoun received each of these offerings with seriousness, examined them, and asked questions about where she had found them. By the 3rd week, Lucy had appointed herself his guide to the property's more unusual natural features, and he followed her on these tours with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was certainly something adjacent to one. The twins required more time. They were not unfriendly toward him, but they conducted what appeared to be a prolonged private assessment, communicating their findings to each other through the small signals that twins develop: a look, a tilt of the head, a moment of matched stillness. Clara did not rush this. She had learned long ago not to rush Albert and Edna toward conclusions they had not reached on their own. Then one evening she came outside and found both twins sitting on the barn fence watching Calhoun repair a section of fence railing, and Edna was telling him something at length about a rabbit she had seen near the woodpile, and Calhoun was listening, and Albert was nodding along to his sister's account with proprietary confirmation. That was that. Frances had already decided, from the day of the coat comment, that Calhoun was acceptable. She added him to the landscape of her life, with the efficient matter-of-factness that was her way with everything. Owen, who was too young for assessments and operated purely on instinct, had simply decided that Calhoun's presence was normal, and had rearranged his sense of normal accordingly. He sometimes went and stood near Calhoun when Calhoun was working on something, and Calhoun worked around him without making a fuss of it. Once, when Owen fell asleep in the afternoon on a pile of hay near the barn, Calhoun covered him with his canvas coat and left him there, and when Clara found Owen later and came to pick him up, she found the coat laid over him with a careful precision that said more about the man who had placed it than any words he had said in the weeks he had been there. She folded the coat and left it on the fence post. The farm work progressed in ways that Clara had not thought possible under her sole management. It was not that Calhoun performed miracles. It was that he had knowledge she lacked and time she lacked and a network of people and resources she lacked. He knew which soil amendments would cost almost nothing and produce outsized results. He knew how to read the land's drainage patterns and which cover crop to plant in the fallow field to build the soil for spring. He knew a man in Darbyton who sold seed at a price nobody else had told Clara about, because nobody else had thought to. He bartered labor with 2 neighboring farms for the use of equipment Clara could not afford to buy, and the same equipment came back to her farm in kind when she needed it. He was building something, she understood gradually, and what he was building was not just the farm, but the farm's relationship to the larger world around it, its position in a web of local exchange that Edmund had participated in and that had gradually unraveled after his death. Some evenings, after the children were in bed, Clara and Calhoun sat at the kitchen table, and she asked him about this, about how he knew these things, about where he had learned them. He answered her questions, but not at length, and over time she began to understand the shape of his history, the way you understand the shape of a country from a map, with some regions left blank. He had grown up in this part of Tennessee. He had left for some years when he was young, worked in various places, done various things he was not specific about. He had come back to the hill country at some point and stayed. The family he had referenced, once, with no elaboration, had been lost in the years when he was away. He did not say how. She did not ask. She found herself, in these evenings, talking more than she was accustomed to talking, about Edmund, about the years before his death, about the farm as it had been when they were building it together, about what she had imagined the future looking like, and how that future had been replaced by a completely different one. Calhoun listened. He asked a question occasionally that revealed he had been paying attention not just to the facts but to the things underneath the facts. He was not a talker, but he was not a closed-off man either. And there was something in those evenings that Clara did not name, and did not need to name, that simply accumulated quietly, the way warmth accumulates in a room with a good fire. The first payment to Hargrove was made on time, in full, from the combination of what Calhoun had put in, and the sale of a small portion of the root cellar stores, at a price that Calhoun had known to get for them, because he understood the December market for preserved food better than Clara had. When she sent the payment, she felt something release in her chest that she had not even been fully aware was held. The second payment came from the farm itself. By February, the fallow field had been turned and prepared, and the arrangements were in place for the spring planting that would, if the season was reasonably cooperative, produce enough to pay the remaining installments and leave something beyond that, something that was not merely surviving, something beginning to approach building. Clara sat at the table on a February evening with the account book open in front of her, and she went through the numbers twice. They were still tight. They required everything to go right that could go right, but they were numbers that added up to something other than disaster, and that was a thing she had not been able to say in 2 years. Calhoun was sitting across from her, reading, a thing she had learned he did in the evenings when the work was done, with a focus that was the same whether he was reading a farming almanac or one of the 3 novels she had noticed in his kit. "It's going to work," she said. He looked up. "The numbers," she said. "If the spring is reasonable, the numbers work." He looked at the account book. He nodded. "They work," he said. It was not a celebration. It was not the moment she felt she was supposed to feel something large and complete and narratively tidy. What she felt was smaller than that and more real. the particular satisfaction of a person who has carried something too heavy for a long time and has finally found steady ground, not a place to put it down, just steadier ground on which to keep carrying it. "Nell will be 15 in March," she said. "I know," he said. He had remembered the birthdays of all 7 children without being told more than once. "I'm going to get her something decent this year," Clara said. "Not just something practical." Calhoun closed his book. He looked at her across the table. "What does she want?" Clara thought about it. "A book," she said. "Nell wants a book. She won't ask for one." "Then get her one," he said. "I will," she said. She closed the account book. Outside, the February wind was moving through the trees, and the farm was quiet and whole, 7 children sleeping in it, a gray horse in the paddock, the barn holding against the weather with its newly sound eastern wall. All of it still here, all of it still theirs. The spring that arrived in Caldwell County that year was one of those seasons that seemed to understand what is needed of them. It was not the warmest spring on record, or the wettest, or the driest. It was simply cooperative, arriving in the right sequence of warmth and rain and mild temperature, and on a farm that had been prepared for it, with the kind of attention that had not been possible for 2 years. Cooperative weather was enough. The planting went in during the first 2 weeks of April. Calhoun had been methodical about this all winter, mapping it out in conversations with Clara at the kitchen table, cross-referencing what had worked and what had not in the previous years, considering the market for what could be sold against the caloric yield of what was needed to feed 8 people through the following winter. 8. Because by February it had become simply part of the arithmetic that Calhoun ate with them and was housed by them, the loft having become as much his formal accommodation as if there had been a lease, which there was not, because some arrangements are clear enough without paper. George became, over that spring planting, a farmer. Not a boy helping a farmer, but a farmer in his own right, a 12-year-old one, who made decisions and gave directions and thought ahead. Clara watched this happen with the same doubled feeling she had about most things that summer, the grief and the gratitude sitting right beside each other. Grief because this was Edmund's work being done by Edmund's son. Gratitude because Edmund's son was doing it so well and had someone to teach him how. Nell turned 15 in March and received her book. It was a novel, a real one, thick and well-bound, purchased by Calhoun in Darbyton when he had gone for supplies. He had said nothing about it until the morning of Nell's birthday, when he had put it on the table beside her breakfast with the same absence of ceremony with which he did most things. Nell had looked at it, and then looked at him with an expression Clara had never seen on her daughter's face before, a kind of unguarded surprise that lasted only a second before Nell's usual composure returned. Then she had said, "Thank you, Mr. Calhoun," in a voice that was not quite steady, and gone back to her breakfast, and Calhoun had said, "You're welcome," and gone back to his, and that was that. Clara had watched the whole exchange from the stove and had said nothing. The summer was hard in the way all farm summers are hard, the endless physical labor of a working farm at its peak season, the heat and the pace and the management of a dozen competing priorities. But it was the hardness of productive work rather than the hardness of desperate survival, and there is an enormous difference between those two kinds of difficulty. Clara understood this the way you understand something you have experienced from both sides. The harvests in July and August were good. The first was corn, and it came in well, better than any corn she had grown on that land since before Edmund died, and she knew it was the soil amendment from the winter, and the drainage and the planting schedule, all of it contributing its part. The second harvest was root vegetables, and they filled the root cellar to a degree that allowed her to look at the shelves of preserved food and feel, for the first time in years, that the arithmetic was running in their direction. The fourth payment to Hargrove went off in August, without any anxiety at all. And she had not expected to feel nothing when she sent it. She had expected something, a satisfaction, a moment of recognition. But what she felt was mostly just practical continuation, the same way she felt when she completed any necessary task. The debt was being paid. The land was still theirs. These were facts that had become normal, and she was glad they had become normal, because the alternative was to keep treating them as fragile, and she could not afford fragility. The children grew in ways that summer that went beyond the physical. Nell had read her birthday book in 3 weeks, and had come back to Calhoun with questions about it, and he had answered them, and this had begun a habit that continued through the summer and into the fall. Nell bringing him books or passages from books, and him engaging with them seriously, never condescending, never rushing, treating her literary observations as the observations of a person worth talking to. Clara had listened to some of these conversations while doing other things, and she had understood that she was watching her daughter's mind open up in a way that school had not opened it. That a real conversation with a serious adult about something that mattered to the girl was doing what school and church and Clara's own teaching had not quite been able to do. George had a different relationship with Calhoun that summer. More practical, more physical, built on hours of shared labor rather than conversation. But labor had its own language, and what George absorbed from those hours was not just how to farm, but how to be a man who took responsibility seriously, who finished what he started, who asked for help when he needed it, and gave it without calculation when it was needed from him. Clara saw her son becoming someone she was glad to know, not just glad to have raised, and that distinction mattered to her. Lucy had taken to following Calhoun on his early morning rounds of the property, the hour when he walked the fields and assessed the condition of things, and she had turned this into a kind of daily performance for which Calhoun was a willing audience, a running commentary on everything she observed, the state of the clouds, the habits of the crow who had taken up residence in the tree by the gate, the way the light changed on the north field at different times of morning. Calhoun listened to all of it and occasionally said something that reframed what she had seen in a way that made her look at it differently, not correcting her, but expanding her, and Lucy expanded easily, being the kind of person who was made larger by attention and smaller by none. The twins had by late summer developed what could only be described as a professional relationship with Calhoun. They had tasks they owned, the feeding of Dove and the management of the chicken situation, and Calhoun had acknowledged their ownership of these tasks formally, asking them for updates, deferring to their judgment on questions within their domain, treating them as the responsible parties they were. Albert and Edna responded to this with an increase in both the quality of their work and a visible increase in the seriousness with which they regarded themselves, and Clara thought this might be one of the more consequential things Calhoun had done, because what Albert and Edna had needed was not help but recognition, and that was exactly what he had given them. Frances had appointed herself Calhoun's weather expert. She announced each morning, with the authority of a small oracle, what the day was going to be like, based on criteria that were not entirely clear but that bore some resemblance to reasonable observation. Calhoun consulted her genuinely, and sometimes her forecasts were right, and sometimes they were not, and either way he reported back to her at the end of the day, with what had actually happened, and she incorporated this data into her methodology without embarrassment, which seemed to Clara to be a remarkable quality in a 6-year-old. Owen called him Cal. Nobody had told him to. He had arrived at it on his own, somewhere around April, and it had stuck, and Calhoun did not correct it, and eventually everyone had started saying it that way in informal moments, even Clara, though she kept Mr. Calhoun for serious conversations, and Nell kept it always, because Nell was like that. On an evening in late September, with the harvest in and the root cellar full, and the account book showing numbers that Clara still checked twice because she could not quite believe they were real, she and Calhoun sat on the porch in the last of the warm weather. The children were inside. The farm was quiet except for the sound of the woods at the edge of the property, the particular sound of September woods, full and almost done. She had been thinking about something for several months and she said it. "You came here for us," she said. "And you stayed. I want you to know that I understand what that is, what it costs." He looked out at the field. He was quiet for a moment. "It didn't cost what you think it cost," he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the field, and his face in the evening light was the face she had been seeing every day for months, unremarkable in its parts and completely itself as a whole, and she knew it as well now as she knew the faces of her children, which was to say completely and without effort. "Still," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I should have told you sooner," he said, "what this was for me, what it did for me." He paused, not searching for words exactly, but choosing them with care. "I told you I had a family once. I didn't say that I had also stopped being anyone who mattered to anything, for a long time. Up there in the hill country, in that life I made myself, I was surviving. I was not doing what I'm doing here." She waited. "What I'm doing here is living," he said. "I forgot what that felt like." He turned back to the field. "So you're asking what it cost. It cost me the excuse I had to stay up there and be no use to anyone." The evening was going golden at the edges. "Cal," she said. He looked at her. "This is your home now," she said, "if you want it to be." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Yes," and that was the whole of the answer, and it was enough. Inside the house, Lucy had started singing something, one of the songs she was always singing, and the sound came through the open window and spread out into the evening air, the way sound does on quiet September evenings, going farther than it should, reaching places you would not expect it to reach. The gray horse stood in the paddock in the last light. The farm held itself together around all of them, the 12 acres that Edmund had started, and Clara had refused to give up, and 7 children had grown up on, and 1 man had come down from a mountain to help save, now holding all of those histories inside it quietly, the way good land holds everything it has been given, and gives it back in time, season after season, asking nothing but the work. Clara sat on the porch in the September evening and listened to her daughter sing. She was 35 years old. She had 7 children. She had 12 acres of workable land in good condition. She had a gray horse named Dove. She had a barn with a sound eastern wall. She had a root cellar full enough to last the winter with room to spare. She had a man sitting in the chair beside her who had come down from the mountain when she needed him most, and had not yet left, and had just said yes to staying. She had numbers in an account book that added up to something other than loss. The last of the light went gold and then amber and then soft, the way October light begins to practice itself in the last week of September, getting ready for the season that was coming. She did not think about what would happen next. What would happen next was another year of work on land she owned and children she would raise, and a future that was no longer someone else's to take. What would happen next was Nell reading another book, and George making another decision in the field, and Lucy singing, and the twins managing their domain, and Francis forecasting the weather, and Owen calling someone Cal in that easy, uncomplicated way he had, as if the word had always existed, and would always exist, which as far as Owen was concerned, it had, and it would. What would happen next was life, ordinary and unrepeatable and entirely, completely theirs. She did not say any of this out loud. She just sat there. The evening settled around the farm, like something that had been waiting a long time to do exactly this, to be still, and whole, and fully itself. And Clara Whitfield, who had never once in her life waited for anything to be given to her, who had written letters and walked 12 miles, and spoken to difficult men, and sent word into fog, and opened her gate to a stranger, and learned to hold on when there was nothing left to hold on to, sat in the warm last light of a September evening, on the porch of her house, on her land, with her children inside it, and a good man beside her. And she let herself be still. For the first time in a very, very long time, she let herself be still.